There are secrets that age you from the inside out, and I've been carrying mine for 23 years. My name is John, I'm 55 years old, and I'm about to tell you something I've never told another living soul. Not my ex-wife. Not my colleagues. Not even the people who came looking. Because some discoveries aren't meant to be shared with the world, they're meant to change you quietly and completely until you barely recognize the man you used to be. It was late September of 2002 when I found it. Found him. I need to be precise about that because precision is all I had left of my old life. I was a wildlife biologist back then, still young enough to believe that understanding nature meant cataloging it, measuring it, publishing papers that nobody read. I'd taken a solo research trip into the Bitterroot Range in northern Montana, tracking wolverine populations in an area so remote that my satellite phone was my only connection to civilization. The nearest town was Hungry Horse, population barely 300, and I was another 40 miles beyond that, up where the mountains turned savage and the trees grew twisted from constant wind. The valley I'd chosen was glacial, carved out over millennia, with walls of stone that rose like cathedral buttresses on either side. A river ran through it. More of a creek, really, fed by snowmelt that never completely stopped, even in August. The place felt prehistoric, ancient, like it existed in a different time, preserved under a sky that seemed closer than anywhere else I'd ever been. The air up there tasted different, thinner, cleaner, with a metallic edge that made your lungs work harder. At night, the temperature dropped so fast you could watch your breath turn to frost in the beam of your headlamp. I'd been there 11 days when the weather turned. A late-season storm rolled in from the northwest, bringing snow that fell so thick it erased the world. I was 3 miles from my base camp, checking trail cameras near an ice field that fed the valley's water supply, when the visibility dropped to nothing. I'm not a reckless man, never have been, but I made a mistake that day. I kept going, convinced I could reach the cameras before the worst hit. By the time I admitted I was wrong, I couldn't see my own feet. The wind drove the snow horizontal, stinging any exposed skin like needles. I pulled my hood tight, wrapped my scarf across my face, and started back toward camp, using my compass and gut instinct. But glacial valleys play tricks on you. The wind bounces off rock walls, swirls and eddies, comes at you from directions that don't make sense. I thought I was heading southeast, back toward safety. Instead, I was moving deeper into the valley, toward a section I'd marked on my map as unstable terrain, avoid. I didn't realize my mistake until I nearly walked off a ledge. The ground just ended, dropping away into darkness. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs, and in that moment of panic I slipped. My left foot went out from under me on ice I hadn't seen, and I went down hard, sliding backward toward the edge. I clawed at the snow, my gloved fingers finding nothing but powder, and then my pack caught on something. A rock, a root I never knew, and I stopped sliding with my legs hanging over empty air. I don't know how long I lay there, face down in the snow, breathing like I'd run a marathon. Could have been 30 seconds. Could have been 5 minutes. Eventually, I pulled myself forward, inch by careful inch, until I was on solid ground again. My hands were shaking. My whole body was shaking. I sat there in the blizzard, waiting for my heartbeat to slow, and that's when I saw it. Not the creature. Not yet. What I saw was a cave opening in the rock face, maybe 20 feet to my right. Dark mouth against white snow, partially sheltered from the wind. I didn't think. I just moved toward it, desperate for any protection from the storm. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for me with my pack, but once inside, the wind stopped. The temperature didn't feel much warmer, but the absence of that constant tearing wind made it seem like a different world. I pulled out my headlamp and switched it on. The beam cut through darkness that seemed absolute, revealing a passage that led back into the mountain. Ice coated the walls, thick and ancient, with that deep blue color that comes from pressure and time. I could see my breath, great clouds of it, but at least I could see. I moved deeper inside, my boots crunching on snow that had blown in over who knows how many winters, and the passage opened up. What I stepped into wasn't a cave. It was a chamber, maybe 40 feet across and 20 high, the wall solid ice polished smooth as glass. And embedded in the far wall, frozen in a block of ice that had to be thousands of years old, was something that shouldn't exist. I remember my first thought was absurdly clinical. Impossible preservation conditions. My second thought was, I'm looking at something that died when mammoths still walked. My third thought disappeared entirely because my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. It was massive. Even curled in what looked like a defensive posture, the creature stood at least 10 feet tall. The body was humanoid but wrong, stretched out, with limbs too long and joints that bent at angles that made my stomach turn. The skin, what I could see of it through the ice, was gray-white, covered in coarse hair that might have been fur once. The hands ended in fingers tipped with claws, black and curved. The chest was broad, powerful, built for a strength I couldn't imagine. But it was the face that stopped my breath. Even through layers of ancient ice, even in the inadequate beam of my headlamp, I could see it clearly. The skull was elongated, the jaw heavy with teeth I could count from where I stood. The eye sockets were deep shadowed, and for a moment I was grateful I couldn't see what was in them. I should have left. Every instinct I had as a scientist, as a man who understood how the world worked, was screaming at me that this wasn't possible, that I needed to get out, document everything, contact someone with more resources, more expertise, more authority to decide what this meant. I took a step closer instead. And then another. I was maybe 5 feet from the ice wall when I saw it move. Not the creature itself. That was locked in ice that had held it for millennia. It was the eye. The left eye, still frozen solid, still trapped behind inches of ancient glacier. But it moved. It rotated in the socket, slowly, deliberately, until it was looking directly at me. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. I just remember stumbling back through the passage, my headlamp beam wild and useless, my breath ragged with something beyond fear. I burst out of the cave entrance into the storm that had somehow lessened while I was inside, and I kept running blindly until my legs gave out and I collapsed in the snow. By the time I made it back to base camp the next morning, following my GPS tracks because I didn't trust my own navigation anymore, the storm had passed. The sky was that heartbreaking blue you only get after mountain snowfall, and everything was silent. I spent 3 days packing up my gear, checking my equipment, drinking coffee that tasted like ashes, and trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Altitude sickness. Hypothermia. Carbon monoxide from a faulty camp stove. There had to be an explanation that didn't require rewriting everything I knew about biology, paleontology, and the nature of what was possible. On the 4th day, I went back. I found the cave again, followed the passage to the chamber, and stood in front of that wall of ice. The creature was still there, exactly as I'd seen it. And its eyes, both of them now, were open, watching me with an awareness that nothing frozen solid should possess. That was 23 years ago. I've spent every moment since trying to understand what I found up there, and what found me. I didn't report the discovery. I know how that sounds. A scientist, trained to document and share, sitting on what could have been the find of the century, and I kept my mouth shut. But you have to understand, the moment I saw those eyes move, something in me shifted. This wasn't a specimen. This wasn't data. This was something alive, trapped, aware, and utterly alone. And I was the only person in the world who knew it existed. I finished the Wolverine study, filed my reports, published my findings, went through the motions of normalcy, and then I requested a research sabbatical. My marriage was already failing by then. Sarah and I had been moving in different directions for years, and my sudden obsession with spending more time in the field was just the excuse we both needed to admit it was over. She kept the house in Missoula. I bought a used truck and a heavy-duty trailer, and by the following spring I was back in that valley. The chamber had changed. The ice wall had receded maybe 6 inches during the winter melt, revealing more of the creature's form. I could see the full length of its arms now, the way its spine curved, the massive breadth of its shoulders. And I could see it breathing. Not often, maybe once every few minutes, but the chest would rise and fall almost imperceptibly like something in the deepest hibernation imaginable. I set up a semi-permanent camp half a mile from the cave, camouflaged and weatherproof, with enough supplies to last through fall. I installed temperature monitors in the chamber, documented the ice recession rate, and started taking careful measurements of everything I could observe without disturbing it. The scientific method was my anchor, the only thing keeping me from spiraling into the impossibility of what I was witnessing. But science couldn't explain what happened that summer. The ice continued melting, slower than the surrounding glacier but steadily, like it was following its own timeline. By July, one of the creature's arms was partially free, hanging down from the ice wall with those terrible claws just inches from the chamber floor. I watched it move, slowly testing like someone waking up after the longest sleep, and then it stopped, frozen again, as if the effort had exhausted it. I started talking to it. I know how that sounds too. But the isolation was crushing, and there was something about those eyes. They followed me whenever I entered the chamber, tracked my movements with an intelligence that felt almost human. So I talked. About my research, about the valley, about nothing at all. Just the sound of a human voice in that frozen cathedral of ice. By August, its head was free. The ice around its torso had thinned enough that I could see the full shape of it, the ribcage that could probably fit me inside it, the way its body was built for power and endurance in equal measure. And one afternoon, as I was changing the batteries on a temperature sensor, it spoke. Not words. Not language as I understood it. But sound, a low, resonant vocalization that started somewhere deep in its chest and seemed to vibrate through the ice itself. I dropped the sensor. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't pick it up. The creature made the sound again, different this time, almost questioning, and I realized it was trying to communicate. I spent the next 3 weeks learning its voice. It had a range unlike anything I'd ever heard. Subsonic rumbles that you felt in your bones before you heard them, and higher notes that were almost melodic. It couldn't form human sounds. Its vocal anatomy was too different. But it could modulate very rhythm and pitch and intensity in ways that carried meaning. By September, we had a rudimentary system. Low sounds for danger, warning. Higher tones for curiosity, questions. Something in the middle that felt like acknowledgement, maybe even greeting. I named it in my head, though I never spoke the name aloud. That felt too much like claiming ownership of something that had existed long before humans walked upright. But I needed something to call it in my journals, in the documentation I was keeping in waterproof notebooks buried at my campsite. I settled on Keeper, because that's what I'd become. Its keeper. Its guardian. The only thing standing between this impossible survival and the world that would destroy it to understand it. The first real danger came in late September. A team of geology students from the University of Montana got permits to survey the valley's ice fields, studying climate change effects on glacial recession. They weren't supposed to come near my research area, but university students don't always follow the plan. I saw them on my trail cameras, 3 days away from the cave entrance, and I had 72 hours to decide what to do. I couldn't let them find it. The ice had receded enough by then that the keeper was 3/4 exposed, still partially trapped but clearly visible to anyone who entered the chamber. If they found it, there would be no way to contain the discovery. Within days, the valley would be flooded with researchers, military personnel, media. The keeper would become a specimen, a thing to be studied and dissected, and I couldn't let that happen. I hiked out to intercept them 2 days later, carrying my credentials and my most authoritative voice. Told them there'd been a rockslide in the upper valley, made the area unstable and dangerous. Showed them false documentation I'd prepared. I'm not proud of that, but I did what I had to do, and suggested they focus their survey on the eastern ice fields instead. They grumbled but complied. Geology students are generally smart enough not to argue with a supposedly senior researcher about safety protocols. But that was just the first close call. Over the next few years, I learned to monitor all permit applications for the region, learned to redirect hikers and climbers with carefully placed warnings about bear activity or trail conditions. I became the crazy hermit of the Bitterroot Range, the weird biologist who spent too much time alone in the mountains and didn't like visitors. It kept people away. It kept the secret safe. The keeper fully emerged from the ice in the spring of 2007. 5 years after I found it, it finally stood free in that chamber, filling the space with a presence that was both terrifying and magnificent. It was weak at first, barely able to stand for more than a few minutes before it had to rest. I brought food, deer I hunted myself, fish from the creek, anything with high protein and fat content. It ate slowly, carefully, like it was remembering how. We developed a routine. I'd visit the chamber every few days, bringing supplies, checking its condition. It would vocalize our strange, limited language, and I'd respond. Sometimes it would show me things, scratch drawings in the frost that covered the chamber floor, images I didn't understand at first, patterns that might have been maps, symbols that could have been language or art or something else entirely. It was trying to tell me its story, I realized, where it came from, what had happened to trap it in the ice. But the gulf between us was too wide. I was a human trying to understand something that had existed when the world was unrecognizably different, and all I had were crude vocalizations and scratch marks in frost. The years passed. I took seasonal jobs to fund my supplies, fire watch in summer, snow surveys in winter, and spent every free moment in the valley. My ex-wife remarried. My colleagues assumed I'd burned out, chosen isolation over career. My parents died, one after the other, and I buried them with the weight of knowing they'd never understand what their son had really been doing all those years. And through it all, the keeper waited, grew stronger, learned to navigate the chamber and the passages beyond it, but never left. I think it understood, somehow, that the world outside had changed beyond recognition, that there was no place for something like it anymore. Or maybe it was waiting for something I couldn't give it. Permission. Understanding. A reason to trust the species that had, for all it knew, hunted its kind to extinction. The first time I saw it in real pain was the winter of 2019. Something in its left leg wasn't healing right, an old injury from before the ice, maybe, or damage from the thousands of years frozen. It couldn't put weight on it. The vocalizations it made were different, lower, edged with something I'd never heard before. Suffering. I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a man with field medicine training and a creature in agony that I couldn't help. I brought antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, anything I could get without raising suspicions. I stayed in the chamber for 3 days straight, monitoring its condition, trying to keep it hydrated and fed. On the third night, it reached out, carefully, slowly, and rested one massive clawed hand on my shoulder. The weight of it should have crushed me, but the touch was gentle, almost tender. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about protecting a scientific discovery anymore. Somewhere along the way, in all those years of vocalizations and frost drawings and shared silence, we'd become something else to each other. Not friends, the word is too small for what we were, but connected. Two impossible survivors in a world that had no place for either of us anymore. The leg healed eventually, and we went back to our routine, our strange half-life in that glacial valley, watching the seasons turn and the ice fields shrink year by year. But the world was changing faster than the ice now, and time was running out for both of us. Last winter changed everything. The climate patterns that had been shifting for years finally reached a tipping point. The valley's ice fields, which had been stable for millennia, started melting faster than anyone predicted. The creek became a river. The walls that had protected the cave entrance began to show cracks. And in March, during the spring melt, a section of the mountain face collapsed 200 yards from the chamber, exposing passages that had been hidden for centuries. Within weeks, satellite images caught the change. Within months, new survey requests started flooding in. The geological anomaly was attracting attention, the kind of attention I couldn't deflect anymore with stories about bear activity or unstable trails. By June, I knew we were out of time. I sat with the keeper on a cold morning in early July, watching sunlight filter through the cave entrance for what I knew would be the last time. It had been 23 years since I found those eyes staring at me through ancient ice. 23 years of secrets and isolation and a connection I still don't fully understand. And now it was ending, not because either of us wanted it to, but because the world doesn't let impossibilities stay hidden forever. I'd spent months preparing, making arrangements I never thought I'd have to make. There was a wilderness area in Alaska, protected and truly remote, that I'd scouted the previous fall. Miles of territory that hadn't seen human footsteps in decades, with cave systems that wound deep into the mountains. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could be perfect. But it was the best chance the keeper had to remain undiscovered, to live out whatever time it had left in something resembling freedom. Getting it there was impossible, of course. You can't exactly transport a 10-foot prehistoric creature across 2,000 miles without someone noticing. But I'd learned a lot about impossible things over the years, and I'd learned that sometimes impossible just means difficult and expensive and requiring the kind of desperate creativity that comes from having no other options. I won't detail how I did it. There are people who helped without knowing what they were really helping with. A freight pilot who thought he was transporting endangered wildlife, a boat captain who didn't ask questions about the reinforced container I loaded in the dead of night. I paid them well in cash, and made sure none of them saw enough to connect the pieces. Some secrets are worth protecting at any cost, even if the cost is your last dollar and your peace of mind. The journey took 11 days. I stayed with the keeper the entire time, hidden in a modified shipping container that I'd outfitted with everything necessary for its survival. The vocalizations it made in the dark were different, anxious, uncertain, and I responded the only way I knew how, with the low sounds that meant safety, trust, everything will be all right, even when I wasn't sure it would be. We reached the Alaskan cave system on a night with no moon, the world reduced to stars and shadows and the sound of waves against distant rocks. I led the keeper through passages I'd marked months before, deep into the mountain where the air smelled of ancient stone and permafrost. The chambers here were larger, colder, more like the place I'd found it all those years ago. It moved slowly, exploring, touching the ice walls with those massive hands, making sounds I'd never heard before. When it was time for me to leave, I stood at the entrance to the deepest chamber and tried to find words for what I was feeling. But our shared language had never included words for goodbye, for gratitude, for the strange love that can exist between two beings that have no right to understand each other. The keeper approached me one last time. It had never done this before, never initiated contact beyond that one moment years ago when it was in pain. But now it lowered itself down carefully, until its massive head was level with mine. And it vocalized, so softly I barely heard it, a sound that rose and fell like a lullaby, like a benediction, like forgiveness for all the things I couldn't give it. I reached out, my bare hand against its face, feeling the coarse hair and the warmth of skin that had once been frozen solid for thousands of years. "I'm sorry," I whispered, even though I knew it couldn't understand the words. "I'm sorry the world isn't big enough for you anymore. I'm sorry I couldn't do more." It made one more sound, our crude equivalent of acknowledgement, of understanding, and then it turned away, moving deeper into the darkness of the cave until I couldn't see it anymore. I stood there for a long time, listening to its footsteps fade, before I finally made myself walk back toward the surface and the life I'd have to rebuild without this impossible purpose holding it together. That was 4 months ago. I've been back to Alaska twice since then, hiking in with supplies I leave at the cave entrance, checking the trail cameras I installed to monitor the area. The keeper hasn't left the cave system. The cameras occasionally catch movement in the deep passages, a shadow that's too large, too deliberate to be anything else. But it's alive. It's surviving. And no one else knows it's there. I'm back in Missoula now, trying to remember how to exist in regular human society. I got a job teaching at the community college. Basic biology, nothing too demanding. My apartment is small and warm and feels wrong after so many years sleeping in a tent with mountains pressed close on all sides. Sometimes I wake up in the night and reach for field gear that isn't there. Planning supply runs to a valley I can't visit anymore. People ask me what I did all those years in the wilderness. I tell them I was studying wildlife, tracking populations, contributing to conservation research. It's not exactly a lie. I did all those things in the spaces between keeping the most important secret of my life. But here's what I want you to understand, what I need you to understand if any of this matters at all. For 23 years, I was the guardian of something that shouldn't exist, something that somehow survived the impossible odds of time and ice and a world that had moved on without it. And in protecting it, in learning its language and sharing its isolation, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Purpose. Connection. Proof that there are still mysteries in this world that can't be explained or categorized or reduced to data. The keeper is out there now, alone again, in the same way it was alone when I found it. Maybe it always was alone, even when I was sitting in that chamber talking to fill the silence. Maybe I was just a brief interruption in a story that started thousands of years before I was born and will continue long after I'm gone. But I choose to believe it meant something. I choose to believe that those years weren't just about keeping a secret or protecting a creature from a world that would destroy it. I choose to believe that somewhere in the shared vocalizations and the frost drawings and the moments of quiet understanding, two impossible survivors found each other and learned that loneliness isn't the same as being alone. There are nights when I dream about the chamber, about ice walls and ancient eyes and the weight of a massive hand on my shoulder. I wake up reaching for something I can't name, and for a moment I'm back there, and everything makes sense again. Then the alarm goes off, and I remember where I am, and I get up and make coffee and go teach 19-year-olds about cellular respiration and population dynamics. And I don't tell them about the most important thing I've ever learned about survival and compassion and the wild spaces that still exist in the margins of our too small world. But I'm telling you now. Because secrets age you from the inside out, and I'm 55 years old, and I've been carrying this one for 23 years. And maybe it's time for someone else to know that there are still things out there, impossible, beautiful, terrifying things, that deserve to exist without explanation, without exploitation, without our endless need to understand and categorize and claim ownership of everything we touch. The keeper is alive. It's free as anything can be anymore. And if you ever find yourself in the Alaskan wilderness, in caves that wind deep into mountains older than human memory, and you see something in the shadows that's too large to be real, turn around. Walk away. Give it the gift of remaining unknown, remaining impossible, remaining what it's always been, a survivor of a world we can't imagine, living on in the margins of one we've made too bright and too loud and too crowded for mystery to survive. That's the secret. That's what I've been protecting. Not just a creature, but the idea that there are still places and things and stories that don't need to be shared to matter. That can exist, quietly and completely, beyond our endless hunger for discovery. I found something impossible in the ice 23 years ago, and it changed me, made me smaller and larger at the same time, taught me that the most important things we can do in this life aren't always the things we can tell others about. Sometimes they're the secrets we keep, the responsibilities we shoulder alone, the impossible choices we make because no one else is there to make them. I'm John. I'm 55 years old. And I'm the man who found a giant prehistoric Wendigo frozen in ice, who watched its eyes move, who spent 23 years protecting it from a world that would have destroyed it to understand it. And now you know too. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. But if you have any mercy in your heart, any sense of wonder about the world and the things that still hide in its furthest corners, you'll do what I did. You'll keep the secret. You'll let the impossible remain impossible. Because some things are worth more as mysteries than they'll ever be as answers.